finished with the literacy narrative, we're going to move on to our next unit, a unit on the idea of discourse. So when I talk about the word discourse, what do I actually mean by that? So for the last essay, we looked inward. Now we will look outward. Literacy isn't just related to how well we read and write, as we've discussed. It's also core to our identities. Your task in the literacy narrative was to examine your own identity through your experience with literacy. And as we talked about when we introduced that unit, we don't understand what we are as a writer until we can understand where we've come from. But it's more, like I said, than just writing. It's also core to who we are. Discourse is very similar to that. Of course, literally, what do I mean by discourse? Maybe you are unfamiliar with the word itself, or maybe you've only heard it in particular contexts. So let's begin by defining it and then talking about what context we approach it in. So literally speaking, discourse means written or spoken communication or debate. That's very boring, though. It's also very general. It's why we don't actually rely on literal definitions much in academic writing. For our purposes, however, we use discourse as capital D discourse. So that's different than just language, right? The literal definition basically is virtually the same as language itself, but we are differentiating the two in a very key way. According to G, our main scholar for this unit, language is how you say something, right? It is the tools and the mechanics that you use to convey a message. That's grammar. That's word choice. Discourse, on the other hand, is something more and different than that. Discourse is not how you say it, but what you are and do when you say it. In other words, discourse integrates words, acts, values, beliefs, attitudes, and social identities, as well as gestures, glances, body positions, clothes. It's everything, right? So it's far more expansive than the word language itself. So what does that mean more specifically? Capital D discourse is not just limited to language, but it's more of an identity kit that we use to navigate the communities that we occupy. These discourses give us what G calls situational identities. We move back and forth through identities regularly, and in each one we possess a variety of different social dynamics. These identities, or capital D discourses, are tiered. There are primary and secondary discourses, and dominant and non-dominant. Your primary discourse, in which you are integrated not by overt instruction but by membership, is probably your family, right? That is the community to which you identified first. It is your foundational identity. The other discourses you claim membership to are more intentional and come second to this primary one. What I mean by intentional here, we're going to get more in depth in a moment, but you can think of it simply as you did not choose to be a member of your family, you just are. These other communities you made the conscious choice to join, which then means that in order to join, you must hit a certain barrier, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But first, let's get a little less abstract. Let's look at an example, and let's look at me. My primary discourse, like most people, is my family, right? We start there at that core. In my family, we have certain language that we use together. We all share certain mannerisms. We all have similar experiences and memories. Every time I talk to my mom, we don't have to reintroduce or reestablish ourselves because our shared language is already there. The other most dominant discourse, and we'll define the difference between primary, secondary, and dominant and non-dominant in a moment, but my other dominant discourse is my academic one. I use academic language in conversation not just because it's useful for my field, but because it identifies me as a member of that community. When you read through Sponsors of Literacy, you notice that heightened language, that difficult word choice, difficult syntax, all of that is intentional, not just because it's useful for the ideas being conveyed, but because it also establishes Brant as an authority in her field. So when I use that language, I'm seeking to do the same thing. This also extends to my mannerisms and my dress, both consciously and unconsciously. I model my behaviors, my speech, my writing style to the expectations of the academic field, right? If you were to put me in a room with a bunch of other academics, I'd probably look very similar to them. And not just in the way that I dress, but also in the way that I carry myself, the conversations that we have, the words that we use. Those two identities are not the only ones that I possess. I have an identity within the English department at Collierville High School, right? That very specific community there. I fulfill a very particular role. I have an identity with this school more broadly speaking. I have an identity with my friend groups, and even more than that, I have an identity within each friend group itself, right? We all have kind of concurrent groups of friends within different social situations. I have an identity within my marriage, right? Particular language and context that makes sense only between my wife and myself. I have an identity that's associated with my gender, and that plays into the way that I navigate each of those different communities. and I have an identity with my race and my country of origin that also influence the way that I interact with all of those various different communities. Hopefully that you noticed that within that list of communities and identities that I just gave you, several of those clash, right? They're not all together joined. They are not equal. While my family is my primary discourse, it isn't very useful in terms of language analysis because it is what G calls as initial. What this means is that there's no membership to attain within that primary discourse. You don't have to master any techniques or any particular specialized language to be part of your family. You simply are. Even if, for instance, you don't get along with them, you don't enjoy being around them, you are, by definition of your birth, part of that family unit. That doesn't mean that those discourses aren't full of complexity. Any of you could probably talk to me about how complicated your family life is. But for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on secondary discourses. Secondary discourses require that you earn membership, that you attain a necessary set of skills and language. This requires something we call full fluency. You either are a member or you're not. In a very basic, very simplified example, don't read too much into this, you can't kind of be on a soccer team. You either are or not. You can be terrible at soccer, but you either are a part of the team or you are separate from it. There is no in between. These identities are very similar. These communities that you join that require membership like that, you either are in or you are not. These discourses, which constitute each of us as persons, are changing and often not fully consistent with each other. Some of these discourses are dominant. What that means here is that they bring potential prestige or social status, and some are non-dominant, which discourses in solidarity with a smaller group. So if I claim hold to a community that I think will get me somewhere, so for example, the academic community, I'm a member of that community not just by interest, but because I think it will drive me forward in prestige, in social status, in my career, right? But the communities that I establish with my friends groups, those discourses are less dominant, right? They are simply a social space and not a space of networking. With each community, as I mentioned, my behavior, speech, and mannerisms change to fit that social situation. I'm not the same person with my wife that I am in the classroom. I'm not the same person in my friend groups that I am with her, right? Each of these different spaces require a different sort of positioning. And I don't just do this, so do you. As we grow, the communities and identities that we claim membership to change. Some we abandon, some our roles within those communities change. We progress further in that community. We become what is referred to as an elder of that community. And therefore the needs of that particular discourse changes as well. So maybe you're wondering, what does this mean for me? What am I doing with this? Why are we talking about this? Which tends to be where you all come back to anyway. We spent a very, very short time discussing literacy. We didn't really have time to get into all the theoretical stuff that Sponsors of Literacy covers and all of those things that I would have loved to have talked about more in depth, but our schedule necessitated that we moved forward pretty quickly. But central to our discussion of literacy and that narrative is this idea of identity. Hopefully, you notice that that's shared with discourse. In the G essay that you're going to read, G defines literacy as the mastery of or fluent control over a secondary discourse. Notice that those two things are tied together and tethered in this definition. The bridge between literacy and discourse for our purposes then is this idea of identity. So when we talk about literacy, when we talk about discourse, when we're interrogating what those two things mean, we're always going to bring it back to how do those influence how you are and how you perceive yourself. Our focus in the analysis we conduct will be on secondary discourses, largely because in a secondary discourse, we can really look at the language practices of that discourse. Your family might have terminology or inside jokes or things that you reference together as a unit, but your membership in that unit is not necessitated on you understanding that language. But for instance, in a football team, if you don't understand the terminology or the rules of the game, you cannot actively participate in that community. See the difference there? One is innate, you can't change it. The other is defined by membership. That's the one we want to look at closely. So what are we going to do with this? What do you mean by we're going to look at? Eventually, we will use this knowledge of discourse to study what we refer to as discourse communities, which are more official discourses with very specific rules and guidelines. For example, that football team that I just mentioned. There are very specific rules and established hierarchy that go into being part of a football team, right? You fulfill a very specific position on the field. You are within a specific side of the game, offense or defense. You have specific people on top, the coaches, who coordinate with each other and confer to you what you're supposed to do. There's also language that is tied to that community that wouldn't really make sense outside of the context of a football team. We're going to dive into a lot of that stuff as we move through this unit. What your ultimate objective is, which we're not assigning today, we'll get to that by the end of the week. You will compose an analysis that examines one of these communities. But we cannot do that in depth until we really understand what discourse means. And remember, when we use that word, we are talking capital D discourse. So your next step is to read the GSA that this information largely comes from. Literacy, Discourse, and Linguistics. It's in the book on page 507 to 521. If you don't have the book, you can actually find this PDF very easily online, and I'm also going to upload a copy of it as well. It is the most critical reading we will do for this unit, so you've got to have it. You've got to read it, and you've got to make sure that you're good. Then after that, I want you to consider what identities and discourses you belong to, right? Notice that those terms are a little bit interchangeable. Are these communities in conflict with each other? Do your identities, when examined individually, create a conflicting view of yourself? Do you kind of feel after you do this that you're a little all over the place? All of that's natural. Because you probably don't really think of your identities individually, but instead you think of your identity as a whole concept. But what discourses allow us to do is to really look at each of those segments of our identity and look at the way that we navigate those different social settings. When I'm in an academic space, I'm a different person than I am outside of it. And it's interesting to look at the ways in which those mannerisms change and my language changes. And it's interesting to see how sometimes that seems totally in conflict with what I do outside of the classroom. And that is kind of what we're doing with this, right? We want to see the ways in which we navigate different fields, and we want to look at the language that people within those communities use. So if you're confused by this, understandable, kind of go back and review some of it, but more importantly, read that GSA. I'm going to follow up on this video with kind of a more significant video on discourse communities itself as a subject, and then I'm actually going to record a video specifically on G's essay where we kind of break down each section to make sure that you understand what you're reading. But this is where we start with discourse. I hope some of it made sense, and if you have questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.